Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson tonight. Imagine you're Joe Biden and you're required to give a State of the Union address because it's in the Constitution. So if you're Biden, it would take a lot of brass to stand up on live television and claim the U.S. is better off than it was when you took over. Could you do that? Well, in a little more than an hour, Joe Biden will do that. If only it were true. It's not true. This country is more divided, less self-confident, more confused, and sadder than it's been in living memory. For the first time in generations, we face the actual risk of a world war. Our problems are fixable, but they are profound, and they require the full attention of wise and serious leaders who love the country and who are willing to think beyond the next election. Instead, unfortunately, we've got Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and the cast of mediocrities who stand behind them making the actual decisions. So if we had to guess, we would guess that Biden is going to use his speech tonight as yet another opportunity to brag about his victories and blame his failures on others. January 6th, Vladimir Putin. We don't expect a single honest word. We hope we're surprised, but we don't expect to be. In the meantime, here's as close to we can get as a statistical analysis of the actual State of the Union under Joe Biden. Since his predecessor, Donald Trump, gave his final address to the joint session of the Congress, the cost of food staples in the United States, a pretty good measure, has risen by more than 20%. The price of gasoline has gone up by more than 40% and diesel even higher. Consumer confidence, meanwhile, is the mirror image. It's dropped by 40%. What's risen is credit card debt. That's now at an all-time high, over $1 trillion cumulatively, it is estimated, and homelessness as well. There are now tens of thousands more Americans living on the streets than there were when Joe Biden became president. He'll ignore that fact tonight, guaranteed. What could he say about it? On the other hand, how could he ignore it? But again, he will. Interest rates, meanwhile, have skyrocketed. The number of new home buyers is lower than it's been at any point in modern history. The number of working-age American men who are actually working is now under 68%. Take a look at the graph on your screen. If anything is an emergency, that's an emergency. But it's being ignored. We'll just import new workers. And that's why the southern border of the United States is open tonight, as it has been for 2 years. And because it's open, millions and millions and millions of foreign nationals have streamed across into our country illegally. In many cases, we know nothing about them at all. We can't even imagine how their presence long-term will affect our economy or already strained social services, the ones you've paid for your entire life. You think healthcare is in shambles now? Go ahead and visit an emergency room in 5 years. Good luck. Already strained social services, the ones you've paid for your entire life. You think healthcare is in shambles now? Go ahead and visit an emergency room in 5 years. Good luck. When Joe Biden took office, that number went up to nearly 50%. And of course, it's all the administration talks about, race. Race is not a solvable condition. It's genetic. It never changes. So if you focus on it, ultimately you'll make people hate each other. And that's what's happening. That might make you anxious about the future. But of course, our future is education. All of us have heard that since birth in this country. So how are our schools doing under Joe Biden? Well, here's one measure. The national average ACT score in 2022 hit its lowest level in more than 3 decades. SAT scores have gone down too. Now just over 40% of all test takers, 40% meet or exceed standards in reading, writing, and math. Test results in certain cities are even worse. In Baltimore, for example, at least 23 schools have not a single student, not one student in the whole school, proficient in math. So how has the Biden administration responded to this? Are there alarms going off in the education department? No. Schools are just failing to measure the failure. They're getting rid of standardized tests up and down the chain, including Harvard, which just made them optional. The American Bar Association says law students don't even need to take the LSAT anymore because tests are racist. So there's a lot of concern, expressed concern about racial justice and equity. Has that helped people? Well, it's made a few people very rich. The ladies who run Black Lives Matter have a lot of houses. But how are ordinary people doing? Are they better off for all of it? No. Life expectancy in the United States has continued to decline for all races, black and white Americans. It's now at its lowest level, life expectancy, in over 25 years. Now, that's not just due to COVID. Those numbers have been declining every year for the past 4 years. Suicides up roughly 5% that we know of. Overdose deaths up more than 50% since before the pandemic. Alcohol deaths up more than 30%. Now, these aren't so much medical problems as they are famously deaths of despair. And what's jarring is that there doesn't seem to be an option for many Americans. A lot of people in this country don't think they can be saved. Church membership has just dropped below 50% for the first time ever in the history of this country. So it's a sad, secular country with decreasing reservoirs of hope. And military enlistment is a pretty good measure of how people feel about that. The Pentagon has fallen short of its enlistment targets by 25%. That's more than 15,000 recruits. So what's growing and thriving in this country under Joe Biden? Well, weed dispensaries are. They're popping up everywhere, and the Biden administration is encouraging this. That's the Biden economy. Weed dispensaries backed by private equity. Cannabis sales have exploded in this country, gone from $12 billion to more than $30 billion a year. So we're building back better. We're building a lot of weed dispensaries. It's not exactly what we were promised. We'll stop the analysis there, but you get the point. The question is, what will Biden say about all of this? Now, an honest man who cared about the country would identify the problems honestly so we could solve them. Take responsibility for some, shift the blame on others. That's okay. But tell us the truth. If people are dying younger, killing themselves, living on the street, if credit card debt is at an all-time high, you can't tell us the State of the Union is strong. And if you can't tell us that, then we can't fix it. Charlie Hurt is the opinion editor of the Washington Times. He joins us tonight. Charlie, great to see you. So again, Biden doesn't have a choice since the Constitution prescribes this speech. But I mean, what could you say if you were him? Could you really get up and say the State of the Union is strong thanks to me?
I think he will do his best. We will see that. That's exactly what we will see tonight, because this is a man who is a creature of Washington. He has been here for over 50 years. It's the only job he's ever had, which is pretty remarkable considering that he's a millionaire today based on a government salary for his entire adult life and his wife's school teacher's salary. How many government workers married to a school teacher out there own multiple vacation homes and are millionaires many times over? That's who this is. So I expect him to go full bore on claiming that the State of the Union is good, and you did an excellent job of sort of ticking through all of those things. But the two just two things that I would focus on. One is the big picture constitutional aspect of all of this. This man, more than any president in our history, has surrendered American sovereignty. We no longer have a southern border. He's completely given it up. He doesn't even care about it. He's and to the point that he doesn't even care about our sovereignty when it comes to our own airspace. He's given it all up, doesn't care. And it's all part of a political scheme on his part. The second thing I would point to is his foreign policy chops. This is a guy who is the greatest foreign policy expert Washington has ever seen, and he alone allowed the situation where Russia invaded Ukraine. And that tells you about all you need to know about the state of our country under this guy.
I think that's a fair assessment. Charlie Hurt of the Washington Times, great to see you tonight.
Great to see you.
So it's one thing to preside over measurable decline of a country. Biden has done that. But why humiliate the country? Why rub it in their faces? Why scream to them in their right on television, you're weak. You deserve no defense. Well, that is effectively what the administration did this and last week by allowing a Chinese spy balloon, Chinese military aircraft, to cross over the entire continental United States. Biden may brag tonight that they shot it down over South Carolina, but really, he's likely not to say much about it, actually, according to one administration official. We will see. Chris Bedford is executive editor of Common Sense Society. He joins us to assess. It's almost too painful. It just happened 2 days ago, but it's almost too painful to remember the fact that the Biden administration let this happen. What do you think he says about it tonight?
I don't expect him to want to talk about it at all, unless maybe he's going to brag that they shot it down while it surveyed important installations in the Atlantic Ocean. He let it go over actual important U.S. military installations, and he did it, it seems, because he didn't want to ruin a diplomatic trip to China. And that's the action of a weaker country. That's something that maybe Kenya would want to avoid embarrassment before the United States arrived there, because the United States is the more powerful country and that kind of thing. In that situation they put us in with China. But the balloon on its own is really just a symbol of what's actually going on with the Chinese relationship with America. Until just a few years ago, China was manufacturing the drones the Department of Interior used to survey our land. You can guarantee there was spy software on that. There are tens of thousands of Chinese spies in our universities and our corporations. None of them are being deported. None of them are being interrogated or investigated. There are actual Chinese police stations in our cities, including in Manhattan, that are only getting raided after journalists expose them, and Chinese apps are spying on our children with TikTok. So our relationship can really be summed up by this balloon thing, which is a weaker state that is not challenging China. Will they actually take serious spying operations on us?
I mean, there's been this debate for years about what we do about Taiwan if they move against Taiwan. I think there are two legitimate sides. Personally, I think there are two legitimate sides to that debate. But allowing a Chinese military aircraft to hover over your country for a week, I mean, that's as clear a statement as you could make about your beta position, is it not?
It is, and all those politicians who yell loudest about Taiwan are the ones who never want to deal with the actual problems, what China's doing in this country right now.
Exactly. Wow, is that an insightful point? Spoken by someone who lives in Washington. You know how it works. Chris Bedford, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So we're willing to bet that Joe Biden, in his State of the Union address at the beginning of the next hour, will not announce any new plan to secure the southern border, which is wide open. How wide open is it? Well, we have new exclusive and very disturbing footage from our border. Fox's Trace Gallagher has it for us tonight. Hey, Trace.
Hey, Tucker, these high-speed chases that involve human smuggling have become routine in Pinal County, Arizona, because you have Interstate 10 that runs through vast stretches of open land and open road. In this case, 32-year-old Timothy Briolis was driving a red GMC SUV carrying 4 illegal migrants when a Pinal County deputy tried to pull him over. Instead, police say Briolis sped away. And after a 4-mile high-speed pursuit, the suspect vehicle, as you can see, went over into oncoming traffic before the driver lost control and flipped over. 2 of the migrants were ejected, but they all somehow survived. The crash shut down Interstate 10 in both directions. The suspect is not only facing smuggling charges, but deputies say he also appeared to be impaired by drugs. The Pinal County Sheriff says the cartels are now recruiting young people in the United States to help smuggle migrants, paying them $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 per migrant. A few months ago, a 19-year-old woman was caught smuggling migrants. She too tried to run and had her toddler, an infant, in the car at the time. The sheriff says the smugglers often run in tandem, where 2 vehicles will head down I-10 together, one carrying migrants, the other carrying drugs. Local and state police tend to catch a fair share, but they acknowledge that many of the suspects, as we know, get away. Tucker.
Of course they do. Trace Gallagher for us tonight. Thank you so much.
Yep.
So the Congress hauled some Biden officials up to the Hill today to testify on what's happening at the border. We're seeing new records for the number of illegal aliens pouring into this country. Hundreds of thousands arriving every month. Those are just the ones we know about, all smuggled by the drug cartels. Republicans are trying to figure out what to do about it. So far, they've introduced articles of impeachment against the DHS secretary. Brit Hume has seen, well, probably about at least 50 State of the Union addresses. He's an expert, the world's living expert on this subject. That's why he's our senior political analyst on Fox, joins us to assess the speech. Brit, thanks so much for coming on. What do you expect the president to say about the border?
I think he'll try to say very little about the border. And, you know, you try to imagine what he could say.
Yes.
He might say that, you know, apprehensions are down a bit, which, according to whose numbers you use, they may or may not be. But the main situation remains almost the same. People are streaming across the border, believing that the policies have encouraged them to come, believing in effect that they will be welcome, and what's to tell them otherwise? I mean, they come with almost certainly invalid claims of asylum. Their claims are to be adjudicated at a later date. Meanwhile, they are released into the interior of the country. So they're all over the place, and there are hundreds of thousands of them, and the numbers have gone up dramatically since this president has been in office. And why is that? Well, one reason is, of course, that Donald Trump had cobbled together a sort of set of policies and practices that had cut down on the flow of illegal immigrants across the border. And on basically his first day in office, Joe Biden blew them all up.
You've covered every scandal in contemporary history. This seems like, partisan considerations aside, this seems like an actual scandal to me.
What's extraordinary about it is that there's been no serious efforts to remedy this situation, and one can only conclude one of or both of two things. One is that these Democrats, and the president among them, of course, believe that these are some of the most downtrodden people of the earth, that they really need to come to America to improve their lives. That's reason number one. I don't doubt it's sincere in the minds of many. The other one is, of course, they imagine that these immigrants will come to America, that in the fullness of time, they will become citizens, and they will gratefully vote Democratic.
Not allowed to say that, Brett. It's so obvious, but you can't say it. Sorry. We're just going to come back and take that back.
Oh, no.
Just kidding. Great to see you. Britt Hume, thank you. Joe Biden is going to use the State of the Union to tout all of our many successes abroad. What do those successes look like? More coverage of Joe Biden's State of the Union address straight ahead. Walls are racist, and the U.S. Capitol is the people's house. That was the old America. In the new America, Joe Biden's America, the Congress is surrounded by walls. Fox's Kevin Corke has that story for us tonight. Hey, Kevin.
Evening, Tucker. For the third year in a row, an 8-foot-high black metal fence has been erected around, as you aptly point out, the People's House, the U.S. Capitol, ahead of remarks tonight by Joe Biden. It'll be that way, by the way, at least until tomorrow. And in case you're wondering, why is this all happening? Well, this is the result of a call made by the Department of Homeland Security, which has designated this a national security special event. The remarks tonight by the president. Now, for their part, the U.S. Capitol Police have deemed this fencing necessary, quote, out of an abundance of caution. And, of course, this has all become the new normal here in the nation's capital, at least under this administration. And that means roads are closed once again near the Capitol, creating a nightmarish commute for many Americans here in the nation's capital, and obviously an irritating inconvenience for many others. Now, it is also fair to point out, Tucker, if you'll allow me, it is not lost on critics that here we have a fence being put up around the Capitol building, despite this very president halting construction of a wall along the U.S. southern border. He called it costly and ineffective. Some would say that is a bit hypocritical, Tucker.
Yeah, if you're afraid of the people you govern, maybe you're not doing a good job. Just a thought. Kevin Corke, great to see you tonight. Thank you.
You too.
So the war in Ukraine is likely to be a centerpiece of tonight's speech by Joe Biden. What he probably won't mention is that shortly after the war broke out, a war that has basically destroyed the nation of Ukraine he claims to care about, both Ukraine and Russia signified they were open to a negotiated ceasefire and came very close to it. But apparently the Biden administration prevented that. How do we know? Well, because the former Prime Minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett, just said the West, meaning the Biden administration, blocked a truce in order to, quote, keep striking Putin. This seems like a huge story from a reliable source. Tulsi Gabbard is a former presidential candidate we thought we would check in with on this story. Tulsi Gabbard, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks,
so I have no idea why the former Prime Minister of Israel admitted this in public. I'm so grateful that he did. How can Biden, how can the New York Times, the Washington Post, how can all the cheerleaders for this refuse to acknowledge this fact?
This is huge. We could have prevented this. Our leaders, those in power, could have prevented this, and they didn't. And the fact that it's not being widely reported is incredibly revealing, and it just shows they never really cared about the Ukrainian people. They never really cared about the American people or democracy or freedom, all of these other things that we hear them giving so much lip service to. It reveals what they've really wanted all along, which is to overthrow the Putin regime. And they saw this war as an opportunity that would help them achieve that goal. And it's disgusting to know that this is true. The thing is, Tucker, you and I both know with regime change wars, no one can predict how they'll end up or what happens next or who's going to take over. But we do know with Russia, because they've already, the writing is on the wall, we do know that in Russia, it's not going to be some pro-Western or pro-democracy, power that goes and takes over. It's going to be someone that is far more hawkish and far more dangerous, creating a greater threat for the United States. The only way that this war ends is through a negotiated outcome. So unless something radical changes, something major changes, unfortunately, what we, the American people, will see, what the Ukrainian people see, people in the world, is that this will continue to escalate, pushing us closer to a direct conflict between the United States, NATO, and Russia. And we've talked about where that could potentially lead: more dangerous weapons, more countries involved, and increasing that risk of a potential nuclear war.
It's so reckless and crazy, it's also completely beyond our control, that this war for democracy has never involved a referendum. People are not allowed to vote on this. Most people are against it, but because they're so for democracy, they won't allow the vote. But I'm really trying to find, since I think this is going to happen, regardless of what you and I say, how does the U.S. conceivably benefit from this? Is there any benefit that you can see?
Well, we know who is profiting from this. You know, the Biden administration and these pro-war Republicans and Democrats in Congress they've sent over $100 billion of our taxpayer dollars over to fund and escalate this proxy war against Russia through Ukraine. There's a lot of military-industrial complex companies that are profiting off of this. And I know there are a lot of folks, as we've seen in other regime change wars in the past, who are licking their chops, looking at the money that they will make and going in to try to rebuild these war-torn countries. But the people who are losing are the people of Ukraine, the people here in the United States. And if this goes on, there will more and more people be suffering more and more destruction around the world, in Europe and around the world.
Yeah, if Americans supported this, the Pentagon probably wouldn't be having recruitment shortfalls, I would think, just a guess.
That's a very good point.
Tulsi Gabbard, great to see you. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we know for a fact that, or we believe certainly, that the speech you're about to hear from Joe Biden will tout successes in Ukraine and push for a much larger war against Russia. Now, Doug McGregor is a former senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense, a retired Army colonel, commanded the last tank battle the U.S. military was involved in. And he has, for a year now, said Ukraine's not likely to win this. And for saying that, he was attacked as a stooge of Putin and other slanders. He joins us tonight to assess the actual state of play. Doug McGregor, thank you so much for coming on. And by the way, you should acknowledge that you've been vindicated by reality after a year of being denounced as some sort of traitor to your country. Your description of what was happening is now what the State Department and the Pentagon tell us happened. But anyway, what do you imagine Biden will say and what are the ramifications of it?
Well, he's going to declare victory when there is none. He's going to insist that the future will be different from the past, that the world will produce roses when in fact we see the opposite. Americans need to understand something. We struggled for 40 years with the Cold War. We managed to emerge from that without a nuclear confrontation with Russia, without a global war with Russia. In addition to that, we ended up as the superpower with superiority in every category of national power. Within just 12 months, Joseph Biden has managed to ruin it. He's not only made Russia powerful, because Russia has profited enormously from this. It hasn't been isolated. Its economy is robust and capable and going gangbusters. Its armed forces are larger than ever. Ours, as you point out, are in ruins. They're in ruins for many reasons. We have too many gold-plated weapons that we can't maintain. We can't recruit quality people. And instead of deciding that we must have quality, we're doing something you're familiar with. We're dropping standards to accommodate people who are not qualified. This is a disaster, and we're spending $1 trillion a year practically on defense, and that's what we're getting for it. I don't know of a larger disaster than the one Biden has created over the last 12 months is even possible.
And as with defunding the police and COVID and the Iraq war, none of the people responsible for those tragedies will ever acknowledge their mistake or apologize. That seems like a core problem here. No one ever admits that they were wrong.
Well, more than that, Tucker, let's face it. As Nassim Taleb would say, none of these people have any skin in the game. Right. That's the biggest problem. They're not part of this. It doesn't make any difference to them that Ukraine's population has been reduced to about 22 million from 37.4, that Ukraine is a dead nation, that its armed forces are in ruins, and no numbers of tanks or new weapons are going to change the outcome. Yeah. It's time to stop it. That's what a humanitarian would do.
Yeah, it was like when all the Christians in Iraq got killed or left and nobody ever said anything about it because, like, we didn't do that. Oh, yeah, you did. Yeah, you did do that. Doug McGregor, I appreciate your coming on and your perspective and acknowledging that you've been vindicated for real. So thank you.
Thank you, Tucker.
So clearly it's too late to do anything about the Chinese military aircraft that just hovered over some of our nuclear launch sites, but some members of Congress are taking the threat from China seriously. Congressman Chris Smith of New Jersey is one of them. He is the chairman of the new bipartisan China Commission. He just introduced a bill to strip China of trade privileges. He's also introduced legislation to remove trade offices in the U.S. that are effectively controlled by China. Seems obvious that every Republican in the chamber would support this. Do you think they will? We're about to find out. Congressman Chris Smith joins us tonight. Congressman, thank you so much for coming on. Pretty straightforward.
Thank you.
Piece of legislation, from what I can tell. Are we going to strip China of its trade privileges? How many members are supporting this?
Well, we're building a group. I've talked to a lot of people, and we're going to get co-sponsors, and a lot of them. You know, back in May 26, 1994, President Bill Clinton severed the relationship between human rights and trade, and that's when we lost China. That's when we lost it. That's when they said all they care about is profits, and in came the multilateral corporations to make money hand over fist, exploiting the local workforce. Under Xi Jinping, they've gone from bad to extremely worse. The Uyghurs are being subjected to genocide. Religious freedom is being decimated all over China. So the oppressor, and that's Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party, are horribly oppressing the people of China. Taiwan could be next, and certainly Hong Kong now has been largely lost. So our bill says, Bill Clinton, you had it right when you were saying there ought to be linkage between human rights and trade. I'm taking that whole template and saying we need to do it, and we need to do it now. You know, China is an exporting nation, as you know so well. Without exports, that economy dries to a dribble. We need to say, unless you make serious and sustained progress in ending torture, political prisoners, concentration camps, forced abortion, all the horrible things. I just had a hearing in July, Tucker, on this horrible practice of stealing people's organs. 50 to 100,000 people, 100,000 victims every year who are killed to get their organs, and they go after 28 years old. That's what was brought out in our hearing, and it's from people like Christians and Tibetan Buddhists, Uyghurs, and the Falun Gong practitioners. This is something that is Nazi-like, and is going on right now. So we're saying they have to clean up their act, or else their ability to send their exports to U.S. markets will be severely and substantially tariffed, and that's what this bill does.
Meanwhile, people like Larry Fink of BlackRock suck up the Chinese in the middle of a genocide that lecture us on George Floyd. I bet you this is probably the only lever that could get any change at all in our relationship with China. And of course, we wish you the best of luck. You're going to need it. Congressman Chris Smith.
Tucker, I thank you. And it will make a difference. It will make a difference. Had Clinton not delinked human rights from trade, we would have a different China today. That's when we lost them. And intellectual property rights are also included in our bill. They have to stop stealing our secrets.
Yeah, the one thing they care about is trade, for sure. Thank you, Congressman.
That's right. Thank you so much, Tucker.
So as the people who run the country, pretty much all of them, file into the U.S. Capitol tonight, they're going to pass by, in some cases step over, Americans who were dying of drug addictions, spray paint, crumbling streets, urban decay. They'll barely notice, of course. Here's a tweet that caught our attention tonight. Quote, had to go to Union Station tonight, walked through a cloud of pot smoke at the front door and passed a guy peeing on the building. Inside, I was panhandled twice, and I watched a guy sell heroin to a woman, which she took into the bathroom. Sad. Yeah, and it's not just Washington. It's everywhere, and it's being ignored, and it should not be, because it's the most basic measure of national health. Are your cities thriving? Michael Schellenberger has been chronicling the decline of America's once great cities. He's one of the great journalists, though he wouldn't call himself that. He's the author of San Francisco. He joins us tonight. Michael Schellenberger, thank you so much for coming on. So if you want to know how the State of the Union's doing, why not just walk outside and look around?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, what you've seen here is a continual decline of standards. I mean, the things that we were documenting in San Francisco and Los Angeles have now spread to most major cities in the country. I was shocked when I went to Union Station in Washington, D.C. There were tents out front. There was open-air drug use. There was people using just the bathroom to go everywhere. These are usually people in a late stage of drug addiction, and we're seeing virtually no action by it. What the Biden administration is actively considering instead is opening supervised drug consumption sites Remember, this is something we stamped out cigarette smoking, but now they want to promote the smoking of fentanyl and meth in special designated zones across the country. That's a decision that President Biden is making right now. He could decide the wrong way. Of course, we know that when Hunter, his son, came into drug addiction, they got the best help possible. They made an intervention. Right. But what we've seen with progressives, ostensibly in the name of compassion, but it's ended up being very cruel, they're leaving people to really rot and die in their addiction. I think the Democrats they've done a real disservice on this issue, and it should be a major issue of national concern that both parties will want to take action on.
Well, I think it's a core issue, and it's such a smart point. I mean, when Hunter Biden got addicted to crack, his dad didn't just hand him a bunch of crack and send him to his room. I mean, that would be effectively homicide, right? He didn't do to his son what he's doing to the country. Anyway, I appreciate your coming on, Michael
You see
Schellenberger.
two standards.
Exactly. Two standards. That's totally right. Thank you.
Could be.
So there's no doubt Biden's going to complain about January 6th again tonight. Our democracy came as close to unraveling as during the Civil War. Please, what a lie. What a total shameless lie that is. But we're also betting Biden will not mention the insurrection that just occurred in the state capital of Oklahoma. A group of so-called trans activists stormed the state capitol there on Monday. They occupied it. Their goal is to keep child mutilation legal in Oklahoma. Here's what it looked like. So it was an insurrection that was not an insurrection because those were Democratic voters, and by definition, they can't insurrect, they can only demonstrate. They're not going to jail. Ned Ryan is the CEO of American Majority. He joins us tonight. Kind of weird, Ned, since the insurrection of January 6th, which does show you how afraid they are of voters who still have testosterone levels at the normal level. They're terrified, right? They're terrified of the people they rule. That's really the right. Theme of that day. But if you're yelping about insurrection and you ignore that, then, how can you even continue to talk?
Well, apparently the only approved insurrections are those that want to advocate the genital mutilation of underage kids. That's the January 6th big mistake, I guess. They should have been yelling trans for Trumps that day. But you look at those videos, 99% of those people look mentally unwell. You think they should be committed and have mental evaluations. But the other thing, Tucker, that's very apparent, a lot of those look to be paid activists, probably being paid by those who are making a lot of money off of this industry, because the trans movement, some people want to call it a civil rights movement. It's not. It's a major industry. It's a major market in which people are making a lot of money off this. This is why you see Planned Parenthood shifting, those merchants of death shifting from just butchering babies to, hey, let's mutilate kids too. That's also a lot of money in this. They're making billions a year, and it's so depraved. They're preying on these deeply troubled, conflicted kids, all in the process. They should be condemned. Instead, they're being praised, and it could be a $5 billion industry by 2030. And the other aspect to me, too, Tucker, about all of this, it's so Luciferian, in which people are standing up and going, I shall be like God. I shall say that boys can be girls and girls boys. There's so many things that are wrong with this. It's sick, it's depraved, and people are making billions of dollars off of it.
It's such a fair point about mental illness. And those of us who are eccentric never like to cast aspersions about people's mental wellness. But self-castration, not really a sign of mental health. I'm just saying. I think, could we agree on that?
We can agree on that, and the sad thing is that nobody's coming alongside them and saying, hey, let's get through this period of your life and let's talk through this before you do something that's life-altering.
Well, that's exactly right. We're the adults. I completely agree.
Right.
I don't blame the self-castrators. I feel sorry for them. It's the people encouraging it who need to be punished, I would say. Ned Ryan, great to see you tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Tucker.
So by this point, are you really going to watch Biden's speech? You should. It's history, apparently. But if you watch it, be forewarned, Biden is going to brag about how he handled COVID, of all things. He's not going to fall to his knees and beg your forgiveness. He's going to boast. Here's an advanced excerpt from his speech. Quote, 2 years ago, COVID had shut down our businesses, closed our schools, and robbed us of so much. COVID did it, just alone. What an adaptable little virus that is. Extending the quote, today, COVID no longer controls our lives. But again, COVID didn't do anything. It's a little bug from a Chinese military lab. Our government shut down businesses and the schools. These lockdowns took place because politicians wanted them, and they took place against the advice of people who actually knew better, like Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. He's professor of medicine at Stanford University. He joins us to assess. Doctor, thank you so much for coming on. I mean, this must drive you completely crazy since you were intimately involved in all of it. To see anybody who had a hand in this disaster stand up and brag about it, how does that make you feel?
It's ridiculous, Tucker. The Biden administration has been an utter failure in its COVID pandemic management. A very large number of older people that have died that didn't need to die if they'd done a better job of protecting vulnerable populations. Children were left out of school in 2021 for no discernible scientific reason, even as European countries opened their schools, leading to catastrophic learning losses, inequality that's almost off the scale. You saw people lose their jobs over unscientific vaccine mandates that are still ongoing, that the Biden administration still defends. The track record of the Biden administration in managing this pandemic is among the worst in American history, and they have nothing to brag about.
I mean, isn't it a scientific principle that you can't find the truth unless you're willing to acknowledge where you were wrong? I mean, isn't that at the center of science?
Science requires humility, Tucker. Humility to admit the places where you were previously mistaken when new data come out, to change your mind and say, so you don't, in science you hold strongly to the method, you don't hold strongly to a particular conclusion, because the conclusion can change when new information comes out. The scientific prowess of so many of the people advising the Biden administration, I mean, I once respected many of them, Tucker, and it's a point of sadness for me to see them embrace these kinds of policies that have been so destructive to the lives of so many Americans.
Really quickly, since, I mean, you are a medical school professor, are you worried about the declining levels of trust in medicine, in the healthcare system among Americans post-COVID?
I'm very worried about that, Tucker. I think that it's vital that Americans have trust in their doctors, have trust in public health. So many in public health, so many in medicine have failed, and they don't acknowledge it. I think the first step to redemption is repentance, right? Turn around. I think if the American public health, if the head of the CDC came out and said, look, we are so sorry for all the tremendous mistakes, harm, damage we caused, that it would be painful, hard to do, but it would be a first real step in restoring the trust that is vital to Americans, the health of the American population.
Repentance is essential to redemption. That is absolutely right. And if the head of the CDC did that, boy, I would applaud without reservation. You know, the country really needs that. Jay Bhattacharya, thank you for your wisdom on this, always.
Thank you.
So the now disgraced and criminally charged crypto exchange FTX has just sent out letters to politicians who they sent money to saying, hey, can you return the money we sent you? Because 1 million people got defrauded. Maybe they should have some of the money. It's not clear if that's ever going to happen. It's also not clear if any of the many media outlets that took ill-gotten gains from FTX, like the left-wing blog Semaphore, will ever pay that money back. Now, this is the biggest financial scandal probably in history. Joe Biden is expected to ignore it completely tonight, even though the Democratic Party was the main political beneficiary of the money from FTX. Glenn Greenwald is a journalist working on Substack, finds the story interesting. He joins us tonight. Glenn, thanks so much for coming on. It's a little weird, like the cynical among us when the FTX story broke said to one another, this will be out of the news in a week. And actually it was. I mean, does that shock you?
Yes and no. I mean, it would be like, you know, if Bernie Madoff was found to be with his tentacles in a bunch of political offices, you would think that would be a story that would go on for a long time. I think the reason why they wanted to get rid of this is it's too revealing. You know, I remember the time that Trump boasted of the fact that he could, before being president, get anyone on the phone in Washington by just offering them up a check and they would do whatever he asked for. That, of course, is how D.C. works, and this shows it. There are politicians who are very liberal, who usually would be in favor of regulating a new currency, a cryptocurrency, who suddenly got adamant that the government should stay out of it. It turns out they were getting big money from FTX. There are, you know, he said in an interview, Sam Bankman-Fried did, that he purposely touted his donations to Democrats and hid the ones he made to Republicans, because the only way to be popular among the media is by having them think that you're donating to Democrats. If they donate to Republicans, they hate you. So there's so much going on here that reveals a little bit too bright of a light on how Washington really works. And
I wonder if is there any hope? You spent so many years in the media that somebody well-funded news organization will just get to the bottom of it, write a clear series on what happened, ever.
The problem is that he was buying out media outlets as well. I mean, so many of them were recipients of huge amounts of money. The Intercept, where I used to work, I founded it and then quit, got huge grant from him, and to this day refuses to return it. And everyone knows, including these politicians, it's not their money. That money was stolen. It was a Ponzi scheme, and people are out without their money while these media outlets and politicians keep the money that doesn't belong to them.
It's really unbelievable. Glenn Greenwald, thank you for that perspective.
Exactly.
So we're learning that Joe Biden is going to single out smokers. Oh, not fentanyl and meth smokers, not crack smokers. All of them are getting federal subsidies. They're cool. No, tobacco smokers. They're going to get attacked because they're the problem. We're going to learn that tonight, apparently. Fox's Trace Gallagher has the story. Hey, Trace.
Hey, Tucker, not only will the president go after smokers, he's also planning to tell us that the administration plans to help people stop smoking altogether with the hope of cutting cancer death rates by 50% sometime in the next 25 years. Now, that said, the president nor the White House will actually outline the plan, give us a step-by-step of what to do. Instead, Biden's so-called cancer moonshot coordinator just released a one-part Kamala Harris, two parts Karine Jean-Pierre-esque statement on how to solve the smoking issue. This is a quote. "We're committed to continuing to use authorities and programs to keep making progress, and especially with a focus on helping individuals avoid smoking in the first place and supporting Americans who want to quit." Our understanding is while the president will focus on cigarettes and flavored cigars, he won't mention, as you mentioned, the prospect of other things like crack, fentanyl, and pot, which studies show are not only harming young Americans at an alarming rate, but also proving detrimental to everything from education to motivation and life overall. Tucker.
It's unbelievable. So they're not going to say a word about the fact they're encouraging marijuana smoking? I mean, it's just like, you couldn't make this up. And I know you're not making it up. The great Trace Gallagher, whom you can see every night at midnight, and you should, on Fox News. Thank you.
You bet.
Now, we're betting, again, we don't have a verified copy of tonight's speech, but we're thinking that Joe Biden probably won't mention the ever-expanding scandal around his son and their family's business dealings abroad. This time last year, the laptop was still considered a dangerous Russian conspiracy theory. Miranda Devine knew differently. She is a New York Post columnist and the author of the book Laptop from Hell. She joins us tonight. Miranda, thanks so much for coming on. So, it's one of these kind of almost rhetorical questions. How could Joe Biden not mention this? But then on the other hand, of course, how could he?
Well, Tucker, I think a normal White House would just stay a million miles away from this sort of corruption scandal that's engulfing Joe Biden's family and threatening his presidency. But Joe Biden has had this lifelong habit of sort of thrusting his sins in your face and daring you to challenge him. And so, for instance, he's invited a dreamer into the room tonight when his biggest disaster is the border. So I would not be surprised if he invited Hunter Biden to join Dr. Jill, maybe even invite Kevin Morris, his sugar brother who pays all his bills, and even maybe Joe's brothers, Jim and Frank, who are involved in that family business. He's invited, for instance, the father of someone who died from fentanyl, and yet he's not offering the solution of closing the border to stop the fentanyl from pouring in. Instead, his priority with drugs is to address the stigma around drug addiction. So who better to have as your poster boy for addressing stigma about drug addiction than Hunter Biden? So I'm not saying he's going to do it. I think probably, wiser heads would prevail, but I wouldn't put it past him. And I think otherwise, every single time he mentions China or Russia or Ukraine tonight, the spectre of that influence peddling scheme that his family earned so many millions of dollars from those countries, that will just remain in people's minds, and they will wonder why he doesn't try and address it ever. Maybe not tonight, but he never answers a single question at any press conference, will not talk about it.
You make such an insightful point that he throws his sins in your face. And no wonder they're afraid of the people they govern. I mean, it does feel like they're pushing the country maybe too far, actually.
Totally.
Totally. Miranda Devine, thank you.
Thanks, Tucker.
Just got a few minutes now until Biden reads his State of the Union address. Biden's staff uploaded this picture onto Twitter showing a binder containing a copy of the speech along with some cookies. And if you look carefully, you can see they've written out the word pause in Joe Biden's script. So they're not just writing his words he's going to read. They're telling him when not to speak. So to put it all into perspective, we go to the man we turn to first to figure out the big picture story. That is Victor Davis Hanson. He's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. He joins us now. Victor Davis Hanson, thanks so much for coming on. So what's your overall view of tonight's State of the Union address?
Well, he's coming to talk to us tonight. With Reuters has him at 41%. 65 plus of his party percent don't want him to run again. Kamala Harris polls worse. 66% of the country think it's going in the wrong direction. So we know what he's going to do because those figures have been pretty steady the last year and a half. And he does three things, Tucker. He misinforms, he ignores, and he attacks. So you're going to hear that he didn't inherit 1.4 inflation and spiked it to 7. Our interest rates went from 2.4 when he came in on a 30-year mortgage over to 6.5, or he doubled natural gas. All the things that your speakers and you've outlined, he won't mention any of that. He'll try to warp it in some way and misinform. Because he can't, what else can he do? And then he's going to ignore, like he always does. So you'll never hear that 5 million people entered the border or crossed it illegally. You won't hear about 100,000 fentanyl deaths. You won't hear anything about racial tensions. You won't hear anything about interracial crime that's gone up, as we saw in Florida, and this doctor that was murdered in a cross-section in California on his bike. You'll hear none of that. And then he attacks. And we know what that is. And we know that he takes his chain out and he hits this dead horse of January 6th again and again, never giving any new information, never talking about new developments, never talking about let's get to the bottom of this with a new investigation. And he will then go after, as you said, smokers, but especially guns, and the people who want to have back alley abortions, the crazy people like that. And the climate change denialist, he'll talk about that. And the thing about it, Tucker, is he gets animated only when he goes after his opponents, half the country. So he'll be on the teleprompter, he'll slur, he'll stutter, he'll be sort of incoherent. But if he strays off the teleprompter, you'll see that he goes into this animated mode. He yells, he gets very excited. That's the only thing that seems to interest him, is to divide the country and go into this ultra MAGA, John Meacham, Michael Beschloff speech writing mode, where he really slurs and smears the people, and then he calls it unity. He sort of makes a desert and he calls it peace.
Hate is what animates him, there's no question. And I have to say, I mean, Michael Beschloss and John Meacham obviously are no great talents. Both have been mediocre for a long time, but they've also been kind of at the top of American journalism history, and now they're just kind of hate-spewing partisan figures. I wonder, like, what does that say? I'm shocked by it, if I'm being honest.
I think they're metaphors for the decline of the American intellectual. They were both kind of credible, popular historians, and they were very careful to seem like they were going to be on NPR or PBS and disinterested. And then I don't know what Donald Trump did to them, but they completely lost all bearings, all sense of moderation or perspective, and now they spew hate. They were the architects about the Phantom of the Opera, ultra MAGA, semi-fascist speech, and it's tragic. But that's happened to a lot of people that couldn't handle this populist recalibration of the Republican Party.
Yeah, they couldn't answer simple questions about why they were doing what they were doing. Why do we have NATO? Shut up! Putin stooge. One last minor question, really quick. You've been around a while. Here you have the President of the United States in 2023, when like no one you know smokes cigarettes, only working class people, and even those most don't smoke cigarettes. Tiny percentage smoke cigarettes. That's what he's talking about. Cigarette. Like, what year is this? 1971? Like, what is that?
I think he looks at the middle class, and he's got this deplorable clingers, which he's used, deplorables, chumps, irredeemables, and he despises them. So he goes after diesel, and he goes after gasoline and trucks, and natural gas, and smoking. He doesn't like the middle class.
Victor Davis Hanson, I am not ashamed to say you're a lot smarter than I am. I appreciate your coming on. Thank you. Brett and Martha pick up coverage of the State of the Union here on Fox starting right about now.